Since June 1943, the airfield baked under the Pacific sun, heat shimmering above the concrete. Mechanics moved slowly between aircraft, wiping sweat and oil from their hands. Near the hangar, one man stood apart, Daniel Mercer, the quiet engineer everyone called the Overcomplicated. His torpedo bomber looked nothing like the others. It had extra flaps, twin rudders, and a tangle of cables that made even experienced pilots frown. Most thought it was madness. A torpedo bomber was supposed to be simple. Fast in, drop, and get out. But Mercer believed precision could save lives. If we can control every inch of descent, he'd said, we can strike from where no enemy expects. The Navy disagreed, but after months of debate, they gave him one prototype. That morning, the plane was finally ready. The test crew, a pilot and bombardier, climbed in with careful hands. Mercer watched from the tower as the twin engines roared to life. The bomber rolled down the strip and lifted into the blue, wobbling at first, then settling into perfect balance. Hours later, at the test range, the plane came in low over a rusting cargo hulk floating offshore. The bombardier took control using Mercer's new adjustable cradle, a device no other bomber had. The torpedo released so smoothly it left barely a ripple. Seconds later, the hulk erupted in a sheet of fire. The crew's cheers crackled through the radio. On the ground, Mercer said nothing. He only smiled faintly and wrote in his notebook, "Calibration holds. Adjust tail linkage 0.2 degrees. When reports reached command, most officers called it luck. But the pattern repeated. On every test, the bomber hit its mark within meters. It didn't just work. It outperformed everything else. Soon, real missions followed. In its first combat run, the bomber struck a Japanese transport convoy near the Solomon Islands. It dropped through cloud and rain where other planes couldn't hold steady. The torpedo hit amidships, snapping the vessel in two. The crew returned untouched. The pilots started calling it Mercer's Miracle. Mechanics cursed its parts, but trusted its results. Within weeks, the data spoke louder than reports. This overcomplicated bomber had the highest kill ratio in the squadron. Daniel Mercer still walked the hangar each night with his oil-stained notebook, tweaking details no one noticed. He wasn't proud yet, only sure of one thing: complexity, when built for survival, could be worth every extra bolt. The airfield shimmered in the afternoon heat as mechanics wiped oil and sweat from their faces. Engines coughed, wrenches clanged, and somewhere among the noise stood Daniel Mercer, a thin, restless engineer with hands that never stopped sketching in the air. To most pilots, he was a genius who didn't know when to quit. To the higher-ups, he was a problem wrapped in blueprints. His creation looked strange beside the others. The new torpedo bomber was bulkier, covered in panels and vents no one could name. Pilots joked that it had more moving parts than a clock, and would probably explode if someone sneezed too hard. The Navy had wanted something simple, quick to build and easy to fly. But Mercer had built something else, a machine that could calculate, correct, and survive. He called it a precision attack platform. Everyone else called it too complicated. The cockpit had extra levers, an adjustable torpedo cradle, and a tail that shifted itself in crosswinds. "A flying headache," one pilot muttered the first time he saw it. But Mercer only smiled. "Then it's thinking harder than we are," he said. The first test flight changed everything. The bomber skimmed over the ocean, steady as if guided by invisible hands. When the bombardier released the torpedo, it slid into the sea like a knife through silk. Moments later, the target ship split open from bow to stern. The crew radioed back one word: bullseye. Soon, whispers started spreading through the base. The mad engineer's plane wasn't breaking down. It was outperforming everything else in the fleet. Commanders noticed. Missions followed. On its first real run, the bomber dove through rain and flak over a convoy. Pilots flying alongside watched in disbelief as it stayed level through the chaos. Its torpedo hit dead center on an enemy transport, a single strike that sent the ship under in minutes. When the crew returned, their plane carried barely a scratch. From then on, the strange, overbuilt machine became a legend. Crews lined up to fly it despite its quirks. Mechanics still cursed its tangled systems, but every time one came back from a mission alive, the curses turned into quiet respect. By the end of that summer, the data was undeniable. The overcomplicated torpedo bomber had the highest kill ratio of any U.S. aircraft in the Pacific, and Daniel Mercer, once dismissed as a dreamer, had proven a simple truth of war. Sometimes the hardest machine to understand is the one that saves the most lives. By the time autumn rolled around, Daniel Mercer's bomber had become both a blessing and a headache. Squadrons wanted more of them, but factories complained they were too slow to build. Every piece was custom, every lever, every cable designed to fit in a certain way. It wasn't mass production, it was craftsmanship. And in war, craftsmanship was expensive. But out in the field, none of that mattered. Pilots swore by the plane's stability. It could dive lower, fly straighter, and hold a torpedo run even through heavy fire. Some crews said it flew itself, though Mercer always corrected them. It only helps you when you help it. The real test came during a raid near Truck Lagoon. Intelligence reported a heavily guarded convoy, destroyers, fuel carriers, and a light cruiser. Other squadrons had tried to hit it before and never returned. This time, Command wanted Mercer's bomber in the lead. The pilots called it suicide. Mercer called it proof. At dawn, the bombers lifted off from the island airstrip. The sky burned orange and the ocean below looked calm. Too calm. As they neared the target zone, enemy radar picked them up. Black bursts of flak tore the sky apart. One by one, the escort fighters peeled away. Only Mercer's design stayed steady, its twin rudders slicing through turbulence, its adjustable tail holding the dive true. Inside the cockpit, the pilot and bombardier barely spoke. The new control system hummed softly as they aligned for attack. The torpedo cradle adjusted automatically to sea height, compensating for waves the crew couldn't even see. When the release light blinked, the bombardier flipped the switch. The torpedo dropped perfectly, skimming the water like a skipping stone. Seconds later, a wall of fire erupted from the convoy. One of the fuel ships went up in a single roaring explosion. The shockwave rattled even the bomber's reinforced frame. The pilot pulled hard on the yoke, and the plane climbed, sluggish but alive. Behind them, two other bombers made it through the smoke and scored hits on the cruiser. They returned hours later. Salt streaked on the fuselage, paint scorched black along the tail. The airfield crew crowded around, cheering. The radio confirmed 4 enemy ships destroyed, 2 more crippled, and not a single bomber lost. That night, Mercer stood by the hangar doors, watching mechanics clean the oil off the engines. He said nothing. A pilot handed him a cigarette and asked if he was proud. Mercer just stared at the plane and murmured, "No," just relieved. It finally did what it was meant to do. Within weeks, the Navy ordered full production. They still grumbled about cost, but results silenced the arguments. Other designers tried copying parts of Mercer's system, the adjustable cradle, the stabilizer controls, yet none worked as seamlessly. His bomber had a strange soul, as if it remembered every flight and learned from it. And so the plane once mocked as too complicated became the most requested weapon in the Pacific. Crews started naming theirs: Lucky 12, Sea Ghost, Iron Angel. Pilots who once feared torpedo runs now volunteered for them. Mercer's design had changed more than tactics. It had changed morale. Still, in the quiet after each mission, Mercer couldn't rest. He'd seen the price of war, and he knew every success meant another crew pushed further, another risk taken. He began redesigning again, not for more kills, but for survival. If the machine can think ahead, he told his assistant, maybe it can bring more of them back. As night settled over the island and the engines cooled, the bomber stood like a dark monument against the horizon, proof that the line between overcomplicated and extraordinary was thinner than anyone had ever believed. By early 1944, Mercer's bomber had become a symbol. Crews pinned photos of it on briefing room walls. Commanders used its name in recruitment posters. Fly the plane that hits every target. But for Mercer, glory brought new pressure. Every success meant new eyes watching, demanding faster production and fewer errors. The Navy wanted to simplify his design, to cut parts and save time. Mercer resisted. "You can't take the heart out of a machine and expect it to live," he said quietly. The new factories were rushed together on the West Coast. Mechanics trained on blueprints that looked like puzzles. The bomber's systems required precision. Even one loose wire could cause a fatal imbalance. Mercer traveled from plant to plant, teaching workers how to feel the machine rather than just build it. "It's not a weapon," he told them once. "It's a promise that if a man risks his life, the machine won't betray him." Meanwhile, in the Pacific, squadrons flying Mercer's bombers were rewriting tactics. Instead of diving straight, they began approaching at odd angles, using the stabilizer flaps to curve their attacks around enemy fire. The enemy had no defense for it. Reports from the front showed staggering numbers. Convoy after convoy crippled. Destroyers sunk in harbors thought untouchable. But war is never one-sided. On a cloudy morning near Rabaul, one squadron flying Mercer's bombers never came back. They'd flown into a trap. Radar jammed, ambushed by fighters. Only a single damaged aircraft limped home, its tail shredded, the bombardier dead. When Mercer received the report, he didn't speak for a long time. That night, he worked alone in the hangar, drawing new systems to protect the crew. He wanted automatic smoke release valves, reinforced armor under the cockpit, and an emergency flotation system for water landings. When the next version rolled out, pilots nicknamed it the lifeboat. It was heavier, but it survived damage that would have destroyed other planes. One crew even returned with half a wing missing, kept airborne by the stabilizer system Mercer had insisted on keeping. The brass finally understood. The complexity wasn't a flaw. It was survival. They stopped asking him to simplify and started asking what else he could improve. By spring, the bomber's kill ratio had climbed beyond anything in the Pacific. Higher than the Hellcats, higher than the Avengers. Pilots swore it felt alive, almost aware of their hands. Some said it could sense danger. Others said it simply gave them courage. Mercer avoided those stories. He'd seen too much to believe in magic. Yet sometimes, when he stood beside the runway and heard one returning, engines limping, metal scorched, he felt something close to pride. Not for the fame, not for the numbers, but because his strange, stubborn design had kept another crew breathing. And still, as victory began to seem possible, Mercer kept sketching late into the night. He was already dreaming of what came next. A faster, smarter machine that could end the war sooner. But deep down, he knew the same truth that haunted all inventors in wartime. Every improvement meant the enemy would answer in kind. The race for the skies was far from over. The war was shifting. Allied forces were pushing across the Pacific, island by island. But the enemy was growing desperate. Their convoys moved only at night now, guarded by destroyers with powerful new radar. Ordinary bombers couldn't get close. That's when Mercer's aircraft was called back into the spotlight. By mid-1944, squadrons flying his design were leading nighttime strike missions, Dangerous. Silent operations where a single mistake meant disappearing into the sea. To most crews, flying in total darkness was madness. But Mercer's bomber had something no other plane did. Stability. Its new gyroscopic controls, an upgrade Mercer had designed after months of sleepless tinkering, kept it level even in blind conditions. Pilots could fly by feel alone, trusting the quiet hum of the instruments. The first of these missions launched from a coral runway under a moonless sky. 3 of Mercer's bombers flew in formation, engines throttled low, radar off. They dropped to sea level, skimming waves so close that salt spray streaked the windshields. When the convoy appeared ahead, faint dots of light, the glow of a cigarette on a deck. The lead plane rose just enough to aim. The bombardier whispered the range. The torpedo slipped away. 10 seconds later, a flash tore through the dark. One ship exploded, then another. Within minutes, the ocean burned. The bombers vanished into the clouds before enemy gunners even found their aim. Not a single aircraft was lost. The next morning, radio stations broadcast the victory. Commanders praised the new tactics, but pilots gave credit elsewhere. "It's the plane," they said. "It just knows what to do." Mercer heard the news while inspecting a damaged fuselage back at base. He didn't smile. He only traced his hand over a bullet-scarred wing and murmured, "It's not the plane. It's the men who trust it." As production increased, new versions rolled out with armor glass and heavier payloads. Mechanics learned to repair them faster. Field crews carried spare servo packs in canvas bags, and soon every carrier group wanted them. Yet, for all the success, Mercer grew uneasy. Reports showed his bombers were being used for riskier and riskier operations. Missions deep behind enemy lines, often with no fighter cover. The very reliability of the machine was making commanders careless. One evening, as the sun sank behind the palm trees, Mercer sat outside the hangar, notebook open. His assistant asked what he was writing. "Something simpler," he said. "Something that'll end this before we forget why we started." He began sketching a twin-engine model that could dive faster, climb steeper, and strike from higher altitude. A machine that might replace his own. Weeks later, during a test flight, that new prototype would nearly kill him. But on this calm evening, the old bomber stood gleaming under the fading light. Its nose pointed toward the horizon. The men called it the complication. To them, it was more than steel and rivets. It was the difference between dying in the sea and making it home alive. And as the war marched toward its final years, the overcomplicated bomber that no one wanted at first had quietly rewritten the rulebook of aerial warfare. The test field was quiet, except for the sound of wind cutting through the palm trees. Mercer stood near the edge of the runway, eyes fixed on the silver shape waiting at the far end. It was his new prototype, faster, heavier, and designed to climb like a hawk. For weeks, he had worked without rest, rewriting every flaw the first bomber had revealed. This new version, he hoped, would be the final word. A torpedo bomber that could dive, strike, and vanish before radar could react. Pilots gathered nearby, whispering that even for Mercer, this was pushing luck. The design was risky. Twin engines, extended wings, a compressed hydraulic system that no one truly understood but him. He insisted on flying the first test himself. "If it breaks," he said quietly, "it should break with me in it." The engines roared to life. The ground shook. The bomber started its run, wheels clattering on the concrete before lifting cleanly into the air. For a few moments, everything seemed perfect. Then, at 3,000 feet, a strange vibration rattled through the fuselage. Mechanics below heard the engines misfire. One stuttered, the other screamed at full power. The plane pitched sideways, spiraling into a dive. Gasps filled the runway. Mercer's voice came faintly through the radio. "Hydraulic pressure loss." Trying to level, then silence. the bomber dropped out of sight behind a ridge. A column of smoke rose seconds later. Crews rushed to the crash site, scrambling through brush and debris. They found the wreckage twisted and burning, the wings sheared away. Mercer was alive, barely, his leg shattered, face burned, but his eyes open. "Did it fly straight?" he asked the first man who reached him. That night, doctors worked through the dark. Mercer survived, but he would never fly again. For weeks, the hangar fell silent. Engineers stopped their chatter, and pilots avoided the test field. It felt like the heart had gone out of the program. Then something unexpected happened. One of Mercer's young apprentices, a quiet mechanic named Harris, found his notebook among the wreckage. Inside were pages of redesigns, drawn even as the plane was being built. Harris took over the project, using Mercer's unfinished notes to correct the hydraulic flaw. The next prototype flew a month later. It climbed smoothly, turned sharply, and landed without fault. When Mercer, still limping, came to see it, he said nothing for a long time. Then he smiled faintly. "You fixed what I broke," he told Harris. "That's how progress works." The bomber was approved for combat soon after. Squadrons began receiving the new version just as the Pacific War reached its fiercest stage. Against newer, faster enemy interceptors, Mercer's aircraft still outperformed expectations. Crews trusted it completely. Its kill ratio stayed unmatched. But Mercer himself never returned to the drawing board. He spent his remaining months training mechanics, teaching them how to understand the machines they worked with. "A plane," he said once, "is only as honest as the hands that build it." By the time the war neared its end, his once ridiculed design had become the backbone of torpedo squadrons. Reporters wrote about the miracle bomber, but Mercer avoided interviews. To him, it was never about fame, only about survival, precision, and the men who believed in a machine everyone once laughed at. When the war finally ended, the airfields that once roared with engines fell silent. Rust gathered on the hangars, palm trees grew wild over the concrete, and the ocean winds carried the ghosts of engines long gone. Daniel Mercer, now walking with a cane, stood beside one of his surviving bombers. Its paint faded, propellers still, but its shape unmistakable. The overcomplicated machine that once divided the Navy had outlived almost everything else. Pilots came to visit him sometimes. Men who had flown through storms, through tracer fire, through nights where the sea swallowed whole squadrons. They shook his hand quietly and said, "Your plane brought us home." Mercer never knew how to answer. He'd only nod, tracing the scarred metal of the fuselage as if touching an old friend. In the years after the war, reports began to surface. Numbers, statistics, comparisons. Among every aircraft fielded by the United States during the conflict, fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, and attack craft, one stood above all in kill ratio. It wasn't the famous fighters that filled posters. It was the bomber Mercer had designed against orders, built through resistance, and tested with his own blood. The machine everyone called too complex for war had quietly become the deadliest of them all. The Navy eventually retired the fleet, moving on to jets and faster designs. But in training schools and museums, instructors still spoke of Mercer's aircraft. How its systems taught engineers to think ahead. How its precision changed torpedo tactics forever. The adjustable cradle, once mocked, became a standard concept in post-war bombers. The stabilizer system inspired control technologies decades later. When a journalist found Mercer years later in his small coastal workshop, he asked what he thought of his legacy. Mercer smiled faintly. "Legacy?" he repeated. "Machines don't have legacies. They just tell stories about the people who needed them." He paused, eyes drifting toward the sea. "Mine told me that being called overcomplicated was just another way of saying we weren't ready to understand it yet." The journalist wrote that down, but the line never made it to print. It was too quiet, too simple for the front page. Yet, for the men who had flown those missions, the ones who returned when others didn't, Mercer's words carried more truth than any medal or report. In the last photograph ever taken of him, Mercer stood beside the final surviving bomber at a naval museum. His hand rested on the wing, sunlight catching the scar across his jaw. Behind him, the plaque read, "This aircraft, designed by engineer Daniel Mercer, achieved the highest confirmed kill ratio of any U.S. plane in World War II. Once dismissed as too complicated for combat, it became the blueprint for modern precision warfare." Mercer died a few years later, quietly, with no ceremony. But the plane remained, a monument to stubborn genius and the belief that precision, not simplicity, could win a war. And somewhere in the archives of the Navy, beneath faded reports and maintenance logs, one line in an old officer's handwriting still told the whole story. The engineer was right. Complexity saved lives. Years passed. The world changed, and the age of propellers gave way to the scream of jet engines. New wars began with faster machines and colder strategies, yet somewhere in the background, Mercer's design still whispered its lessons. The engineers who had once studied his bomber were now designing missiles, drones, and early guidance systems. Many of them carried the same philosophy Mercer had lived by: precision over simplicity. In 1952, a young naval engineer named Alan Foster found Mercer's old notebook in an archive box marked Obsolete Designs. Inside were diagrams for systems decades ahead of their time. Variable flaps, automated stability locks, torque sensors, even early sketches of radar guidance integration. It was as if Mercer had seen the next generation of warfare before it arrived. Foster spent nights copying the pages by hand, building small models in his dorm. One of those models, a control feedback system, would later evolve into a mechanism used in jet bombers across the 1960s. But Mercer never saw that. He had retreated to the coast, living in a small workshop filled with rusting tools and sea air. He wrote letters to old pilots, sometimes sending sketches of designs he never finished. He called them machines for peace. One letter read, "If precision can save a plane in war, maybe it can save a ship in a storm, or a doctor in surgery." He believed technology didn't have to end with destruction. It could be humanity's shield instead of its sword. By the mid-50s, historians began writing about forgotten engineers of the war. Mercer's name appeared in footnotes, a quiet man with strange ideas who built a bomber that defied logic. The public barely noticed. The headlines went to the heroes in cockpits, not the men behind the drafting tables. But among pilots, Mercer remained something else. A myth. In every veterans' reunion, someone mentioned the bomber that flew smarter than its crew. One winter, an invitation arrived at Mercer's small home. The Navy wanted him to attend a ceremony. A new research division was being named after him, the Mercer Aeronautics Laboratory. He hesitated at first, then finally agreed. When he walked through the doors of the new building, young engineers lined the hallways, applauding quietly as he passed. On the wall behind the main desk hung a framed blueprint of his torpedo bomber. Its lines delicate, precise, alive. Mercer didn't give a speech. He just looked at the drawing for a long time and said softly, "It's strange. When we built her, we only wanted her to come back alive. Now she's teaching machines how to think." Later that night, he stood outside under the cold stars, listening to the distant hum of jet engines overhead. The world had gone faster, louder, more complex, just as he had once imagined. But he smiled at the thought that maybe, deep inside all those machines, a small piece of his design and his stubborn belief in precision still lived on. He turned away from the lights of the lab and walked slowly toward the dark horizon, the ocean breeze tugging at his coat. The war was long over, but the idea that had driven him still burned quietly. that no invention was truly overcomplicated if it was built to protect life. And as history moved on, his bomber became more than a relic. It became a symbol of courage in creation, of faith in detail, and of one man who refused to believe that complexity was weakness. The old hangar was quiet again, the way it had been before the war. Dust drifted through the sunlight that poured in through cracked windows. The last of Mercer's bombers stood in the center, wings folded, metal dull and scarred but still whole. The Navy had offered to move it to a museum, but the local base commander decided to keep it here, where it had once been born. A small group of young engineers gathered inside one afternoon, notebooks in hand. Their instructor, an aging pilot who had flown the original missions, stood beside the plane. He spoke softly, running a hand across the worn fuselage. "This machine," he said, "wasn't supposed to exist. It was too heavy, too advanced, too strange. They said it was impossible, but Daniel Mercer didn't believe in impossible. He told them how the bomber could hold its course through storms, how it could land when others fell apart, how it had changed the very idea of what a plane could be." The young engineers listened in silence. To them, this wasn't just an artifact. It was the start of everything that came after. Guided flight, stability control, automatic targeting systems. All of it began here, in the stubborn dream of one man who refused to make things simpler, just because people were afraid of complexity. Outside, waves crashed beyond the cliffs. The air smelled of salt and old oil. The pilot paused, then said, "The funny thing about Mercer, he never wanted fame. He only wanted men to come home alive." He smiled faintly. "And that's what he built, a machine that made survival possible." Years later, when the hangar was finally closed and the plane moved to the Naval Aviation Museum, they placed it in a quiet corner under soft lights. Visitors walked past newer jets, faster aircraft, louder names. But some stopped here, drawn by the strange design, the endless dials and cables that once baffled everyone. On the display plaque, one line stood out: "Designed by Daniel Mercer, the overcomplicated bomber that saved more lives than any plane of its time." No fanfare, no music, just the quiet hum of the museum's air vents and the reflection of light on steel. Yet for those who knew the story, the pilots, the mechanics, the engineers who studied his work, it was more than enough. Mercer's ideas lived on in every modern aircraft that trusted sensors over guesswork, in every system that corrected itself mid-flight, in every machine that learned instead of obeyed. His legacy wasn't in glory or medals. It was in the calm precision that turned chaos into survival. And so, long after the last man who had flown his bomber was gone, the machine itself remained a monument to belief, complexity, and quiet genius. The sound of its engines no longer echoed through the skies, but its design still did. In every plane that rose above the clouds, guided by the same stubborn spirit that once changed the war. In the end, Daniel Mercer's story wasn't about machines at all. It was about faith. Faith that doing things the hard way, the right way, could still save lives. And that sometimes being called overcomplicated is just another word for ahead of your time. See to you, Ans.